Well, today we're going to have a look at shapes. Last time we had a look at lines, and previously we had a look at the external frame. And with respect to all of those parts of an image contributing to the overall design of the image. And whilst we've sort of looked at the positioning of the subject within the image, and we did that when we were looking at the rule of thirds, etc., the role that lines and shapes play in an image is actually facilitate the viewer's eye to wander around that image and guide them through it and provide interest to it. And when we talked about what made an intriguing image, we talked about three things. One was the timing, one was the narrative, and the other was the aesthetics. Well, the lines and shapes provide input into those aesthetics and the narrative. And we'll have a look today how shapes do that as well. So last week when we were talking about lines, we said that a row of points becomes a line, and it may actually be a line like a road, or alternatively it could be just a series of trees and they make a line. But it's the actual enclosure of points that make the shapes. And that allows our eye then to wander around an image, around that shape, and also keep us in the image, because my judgment of, it's my opinion, I haven't read this anyway, but the longer you're enthralled in an image, the better the image is. The longer you can hold the viewer's interest. And really good images, people are quite happy to hang them on the wall because they constantly want to go in and have a look. And that's what shapes enable the viewer to do, is just it organizes the objects within the image and in an interesting way. And it can also contribute to mood as well. So when we talk about narrative of an image, we're often talking about how that emotionally affects the viewer, and the actual shape of the elements within the image can impact the mood. So we can have regular shapes, and we're going to discuss those today, which are just your regular geometric shapes of rectangles, triangles, and circles. But you can also have organic shapes as well. And we see a lot of those in abstract images that allow your eye to flow around the image by the series of points enclosing a particular shape. So rectangles are one of our most common shapes that we see in images, particularly when we take urban shots like we did last week when we walked around Fitzroy. And where they have the advantage within an image is that typically our images are rectangly shaped anyway. And by having rectangles within rectangles, it gives a level of repetition and adds to the interest within the image. And we often see frames within frames, and particularly with buildings and doorways and windows. And again, that repetition just engages the image and draws the viewer's eye into that frame within a frame. So you can see here with these rectangles, there's a certain rhythm and stability associated with rectangles within rectangles. And the one on the left here, we've got both the rectangles being employed as a means of taking your eye into the image to see the soldier, but also the frame within a frame concept of actually framing him in the center of that background rectangle. And on the right here, just the building elements are providing rectangles within rectangles and frames within frames. So I'm encouraging you, when you're out and shooting things like buildings, to try and employ those rectangles within rectangles and frames within frames, and using the horizontal and vertical lines as a means of stability within the image. And that often means taking the shot straight on. So as soon as you start to skew the shot, you start to get diagonals, and it has a different message. So it's so much more interesting to frame an image by using an element within the environment to actually frame it, because it just adds shapes in there. And a lot more interesting than if I'd walked through that doorway and just shot that pool. By putting those shapes in there, it leads you into it and keeps your eye going around and around. The one on the left here is just windows in a building, and they happen to be reflective of the windows across the road, or the building across the road. And so again, it's employing the shapes, and they're sort of used like picture frames. And the one on the right, just using an old, it was a disused building somewhere in Greece. I can't think where it was in Greece. And you tried to use the frame of the old window as a picture frame for the old rubbish. So that's our rectangles, which we can employ within a rectangular frame anyway, and it just adds the same shape, and that repetition gives the viewer a rhythm in which to look at the image. Triangles are different in that they actually add a dynamic to the image, because there's usually a line that diagonally will cut through the image, and it gives it a bit of energy, but it'll also give it a bit of stability if you've got the bottom edge of that triangle on a horizontal. So again, you convey a mood to the users or the viewers by putting triangles in. So in this case, this is how just different ways you can use shapes. I was taking this image of a flower, and it was in the conservatorium, and they had a poster behind that had this dark shape in it. And I thought, well, if I put that shape out of focus, I can employ it as a background to frame the flower that I'm actually taking. So often we can use these shapes as backgrounds to just add extra information to our subject. And I know that we tend to take photographs of subjects, but the background is just as important. And if you can place that subject within a shape, it immediately makes the image more interesting. The other way that we can employ shapes is this image on the right, where we've got 3 women with eye lines, and they're providing that triangular shape. And as the viewer, we go from one to the other, back again, and go around that shape. And it just gives the viewer a guide to what they should be looking at. But triangles exist all the time, and particularly when we use a wide angle lens, it will actually distort the landscape to give us that perspective of triangles. And you can see the stability in each one of these images that those triangles actually provide. Triangles are actually geometrically the strongest shape you can get, and that's why so many bridges and engineers employ triangles, because of their strength. And we inherently know that, so we apply that emotion when we see triangles within an image. Circles are also another interesting shape we can incorporate into our images. They're not as easy to find because they don't sort of exist as naturally, but we'll have a look at how we can see that when objects are actually aligned in a circular shape, they allow our eye to run around that. And they also provide a means which we dive into an image. We tend to exclude things outside the circle and dive into the circle to have a look. So again, if you've got something that you want people to focus on, employ circular shapes and look out for them, so that when you want to take a photo of a nice doorway, how can you make that much more interesting? Could you, and have a look around, and if you can see, you can use a frame within a frame, and allow the user's eye to run around and then dive into it. And the same with this cupola, I think it was in a church. Always make sure where the viewer's eye will end up is in focus, because that's the landing point of when you've got a circular image like this and you've got them diving into it. They need to land on something in focus. If that's out of focus, they just give up. So put the point of focus, shift it around until it is actually in that center of that circle. And you can see with both of these images, your eye runs around the circles and then lands on something that's in focus. And it just gives a flow to an image by having circles in it. So look out for them. When you see them, think about, how can I locate the subject within this circular rhythm to get them to be the focal point of the image, that it's not just taking the subject flat on. And the one on the left, you can see we've employed a number of elements here that we've been learning about. One is sort of lines, and that you've got the series of points giving you curved lines, and the circle at the bottom. We've located the subject on a third, and not quite a third on the right hand side. And there was something else I thought about while I was doing that, but try and all of the elements that I've been talking to you about design, have them in the back of your mind while you're actually looking at something. Oh, I know, the other one was, it was the point of view, that it's far more interesting to get up and look down, or down and look up, than to look at the subject straight on. So try and think of all those things. When you're somewhere that you can climb, as long as it's safe, climb and see if you can get another view of that particular subject, which will make it a lot more interesting. And if you are taking architectural elements, have a think about taking them straight on, so it gives a more graphical perspective. And this is what we've done here with this right-hand image, is by getting it straight on, we could make it very symmetrical and make it very graphical and more interesting. So we see circles everywhere. Try and employ them in your image, because they do make the eye go round and round and round. They can be organic, like the one on the right, where it's not necessarily circular, but they're the rows of things that are actually positioned in a circular way. And we can do that also with people, so that we can create those circles within our images. When we're positioning people and positioning ourselves, we can create these circles to allow your eye to go round and round. The frames within frames, they're not necessarily always rectangular, that we can just employ elements within our landscape to make those frames within frames. And it's sort of multiple images within images. What you have to be careful when you are using frames within frames is that you keep everything in focus. So that means having a very narrow aperture, so at least f11 to f16, so that you can get everything in focus. Because if you've got a foreground, like in the image on the left here, that's out of focus, it's quite distracting. So you do need to be aware to have a larger depth of field. But by looking at the elements and using wide-angle lenses, like the image on the left here, you can get that distortion, start creating triangles, and also provide a much more interesting shot than just getting, I think this was a sunrise, a shot of the sunrise. That the sunrises, as I've mentioned before, are just a background. They're not a subject. And so this image allows all the things to be in the foreground and the midground to be the image, and then the background just adds a wow to it, providing that color. And So, if you're taking photos of small children or something, try and add in something like a frame within a frame or some shapes to just give it that extra bit of interest. The other thing is I often employ overhanging branches of trees to just give that shape, to allow the viewer's eye to run up and around it and then land in the middle in the reflection. So rather than trying to get them out of your image, see if you can employ them in your image to actually give some framing. And if you can see lots of shapes in things, try and get them to work within the image, within the layout and the positioning within the image to add interest. And so these images add frames within frames, shapes within shapes, and they just give the viewer something to look at. And the one on the left here, we've got circles and triangles, and you'll notice that the way that the beams and the roof structures have been positioned within the image is they're running into the corners to just make it make sense from a compositional perspective. You can see the rule of thirds have been employed in terms of where those major points have been positioned. And just the shapes are what make this image. And the one on the right, there's again shapes within shapes within shapes. And it just gives the viewer something to enjoy. So whenever you are taking photographs of buildings or landscapes or people, try and see if you can get shapes within shapes within shapes, and use, on the one here on the left again, I've tried to use this tree to actually frame this building, and then tried to highlight all the shapes within the windows and the brickwork and the textures. And the one on the right, I had to wait forever to get someone to walk through that scene because I really did want them to be in the middle of that beautiful window and the reflection. So next week when we go on our workshop, I'd really like you to have a look at shapes within your scene. So people often, first of all, choose the subject they're going to photograph. I'd really encourage you to try and find backgrounds first, and then position your subject within that background, because that will give that extra dimension to your image. And it also means your background is positioned aesthetically so its shape fits within the frame, and then your subject fits within that shape. So you make sure that your subject is your focal point, but how they fit within that shape of the background is also very important. So that's your homework next week, to think about when you're actually taking images, and think about lines, think about framing, think about looking up, looking down. All of these things build to give you a really interesting and engaging image.